Okay, thank you, Sue. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started this afternoon. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. I think we have Kendal at Home members as well as guests joining us, and we want to welcome everyone here. This is a first in a series of sessions that we're going to be hosting titled Spirituality, Well-Being, and the Wholeness of Life. And a few weeks ago, I reached out to Alan. He had sent me this series he was doing probably earlier in the year. And I asked if he would be willing to join us to talk about this topic with us and do a series as a part of our wellness focus. And we focus on exercise and fitness and health and nutrition and all those things. But spirituality is such an important part of our wellness. And I think it's one that's often overlooked, and I know how important it is to so many of us in our lives. And the reason that I asked Alan Kolp to join us in this is, there are a number of reasons. He is a Quaker, a lifelong Quaker, and someone that I admire in terms of living those values, and is very thoughtful in how he does that and how he shares those. I'm sure he'll share with you. Hopefully he'll share with you at the end. He writes a daily inspirational blog that I make a habit to read, and at times really does impact my life or speak to me in terms of what's happening today. So it's focused on grace and on so important in terms of things that are happening every day. But I think, as professionally, Alan is a board member for Kendal at Home, first and foremost, most important, right? A professor of religion at Baldwin Wallace, but accomplished in so many ways. And I'll ask him to share a little more about him. But I think that his work is one that I respect and admire. And I thought that others would benefit from having the opportunity to share in this experience as well. And Sammy Leffler is a student of Alan's who's joining us and working towards that A+ in this class. And I'm sure this help is going to really push that A+, Sammy. So we'll strive for that. And Sue Waken is here helping behind the scenes. But I'm going to turn it over to Alan and invite you to enjoy today's session with him. And we'll be giving you an opportunity. If you have questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat. But we'll also give you the opportunity to speak. So if you're willing to do that, we'll allow you to unmute your microphone and actually ask your questions as we get into the opportunity for discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Lynn, and welcome to all who are here. I'm delighted to be with the Kendal gang, as I'll put it. Lynn is correct. I'm delighted to have Sammy join me. Sammy's in a class I'm doing right now, which is a fun class for me. I keep telling students, as long as they're interesting, I'll keep doing it. And if it turns out to be boring, it's probably their fault and I'm out of there. So Sammy's a gal I just met for the first time in her life and my life in August, and she's jumped right in. And so it's a delight. And it would be one thing to do this kind of thing, spirituality, well-being, and wholeness of life with an age group like Sammy, but I'm probably more of the age group of folks online. And in some ways, our questions are probably the same and also pretty different. A lot of life experience behind us. More than likely, we're much closer to the end of life as we know it in this phase anyway. And so our questions may be different. Maybe I tell people sometimes I think I've resisted retiring because I'm afraid of what might come when I retire. And so, but those who are in a retirement or second chapter or second phase, or however we want to put it, have questions. So I welcome this chance and I welcome the opportunity to get interactional. I wouldn't presume that I know all that much about what we're talking about, and I'm aware of anybody. A lot of people who are my age have more wisdom and insight probably than I do. So if we can turn this into a discussion and continue to look forward, I've got about, I don't know, probably 8 or 9 slides just to to help us with some quotations and perhaps to guide us through this hour and a half. So with that said, I appreciate Sue being on and making all this possible. I've known Sue for quite a while, since her husband is the women's soccer coach at my institution. I actually saw him this morning when I was in that part of the campus world. So delighted to be here. I have been a Quaker all my life. And whenever I have thought about changing and doing something else besides be a Quaker, I realized now I really am Quaker at the core. So I hang out with Catholics and Buddhists and a whole bunch of other folks, but I really am Quaker at the core. And I appreciate the perspective that brings us. And I was very aware. I was living in New England when many Quakers in that part of the world and the Philadelphia part of the world, usually the approach was to set up a committee that addressed the whole issue of aging. And out of that concern for folks who are getting older, the Kendal idea arose, and the first retirement community was built in the Philadelphia area. It's still there. And then out of that have come the other Kendal affiliates. And I'm delighted to be with the Kendal at Home group here in the Cleveland area. So I appreciate Kendal. I appreciate the fact that it's rooted in the Quaker values, as we put it, and makes it easy to believe in and work with a group like this. So what I'd like to do is just move through some 3 or 4 different ideas. I plan today to spend a little time with each one of the 3 notions that were in the title: spirituality, wellness, and wholeness. Those are all words in English that everybody would assume they know what they mean. But once you begin to drill down a bit, you realize that maybe we are not as clear about those meanings as we might have thought we were. I came out of an interesting leadership class with some student athletes, and I used the word content, and I assumed it had positive connotations. I would be happy to be content as opposed to being a malcontent or discontent. And at one point I stopped and asked the students, so is content a word that you know, and is it a value? And I would reckon half of the people in the room thought it was a more negative word, and that was interesting to me. So we don't always appreciate what words mean, particularly loaded words, like a loaded word like spirituality. So I invite you to jump in this process with me, and we'll move through a few slides. And if you have a question, you can put it in chat. I'll try to monitor that. Or since I can't see you all, you can jump in. Maybe Sue can help facilitate that. So I'd like to begin with this slide, which I'm calling an alternative approach. When people think about wellness, think about health, I think Lynn was right. Typically, they think about physical health, and mental health gets looped in pretty well. I'm aware that I'm involved in our college athletic program, and you may or may not know that the whole college athletic scene, the NCAA, the national, whatever it is, conference of athletes, and it's an organizing body, is going through the process of writing a whole new constitution. And they're giving quite a bit of attention to physical and mental health. And as I read the document, I don't think the word spiritual is used at all. So that's what I'm thinking about as an alternative approach. And as you can see, I want to start with 2 quotations. One of my favorite from Henry David Thoreau, his book Walden, which probably most of you have read at some point. And I keep the exclusive language here. I'll try to read it with inclusive language. The mass of human beings live lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. From the desperate city, you go into the desperate country and have to console yourself with the bravery of minks and muskrats. A stereotyped but unconscious despair is concealed even under what are called the games and amusements of humankind. There's no play in them, for this comes after work. But it is a characteristic of wisdom not to do desperate things. And I like that for a number of reasons. I think the first time I read Walden, it resonated with me because at least I said, I don't want to live a life of desperation, quiet or otherwise. I don't want to live a life of resignation, whether it's in the city or I grew up on a farm. I want to live a life that's full, that's vital. And I'd like for that to be true all the way to the end of my life if I can, or at least until I lose the capacity to make my choices. I want to live a life that, in my language, is spiritually connected. It's spiritually meaningful, so that legacy, which is not something I worry a lot about, but what I've done in life has been worthwhile and it's been worthy. So it would be fun to have a group of you, since I'm sure all of you are interesting people, to explore what does it mean to live a life of non-desperation, even at my age and stage. And this is the last quotation that Thoreau adds there. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is so dear. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life. And I thought about the marrow of life. We know what bone marrow is. What would be the marrow of life that we would want to get to? I don't know that it's the same thing for everybody. I'm not sure my wife has the same aims in life, except maybe in a very general sense. So again, I would think about inviting you to think, what is the marrow of life? What does it mean to live deeply? And I'm particularly interested in exploring this spirituality, wellness, and wholeness of life with you all, because there may well come a time, and maybe it has for somebody on this call, when you're not physically healthy in the same way we were when we were younger. Sammy's at the other end of life, so to speak, and hopefully has the health and the vim and the vigor that maybe I don't have now at my age. So what does it mean to live deeply? And part of where I'd like to go over the next 2 or 3 sessions is to explore what it means to live deeply, if not using those 2 words, at least the concept. And if I'm not content with that deep living that I'm doing now, what can I do to change that? So I'm hoping that we might live our way into some depth, and I like that idea of sucking out all the marrow of life, at least all that I can. So that's where I really want to start. And I wanted to use the Thoreau quotation to get at that. We'll move to the next one. This may seem like an odd title. Instead of a heart attack, I got this quotation from reading one of my alumni magazines, which I must admit, I enjoy reading those things. And most of the people I read about, I don't have a clue who they are. But this one struck me, by John West, who's the Harvard Alumni Association president. Never met John West in my life and probably won't. But I was intrigued what he said. 5 years ago, I was on a plane from Boston to LA, and I had a heart attack. The plane was grounded in Phoenix and they took me off and I was fine. But in those moments, life was simplified for me down to one word, which is love, which you're not going to hear a lot from Harvard Business School guys. I chuckled at that, which I suspect he hoped I would. But I really liked this guy. Life was simplified for me down to one word, which is love. I would be good with that. If you could get down to one word, the simplest description of life that you could manage, what would it be? I'm good with love, I think. And so you'll find that part of what I want to do over the next 3 or 4 sessions is really full of self-interest, because if I can spend more time thinking about what is love, how do I give it, and how can I receive it, then I'm working on the things that are core to who I would like to be. I've never had a heart attack, but when I was in my, I guess, late 30s or early 40s, I was slated to do a major presentation at an international Quaker gathering in Kenya. I was living in Indiana at the time. I was associated with Earlham, if those of you know Earlham, a Quaker school. And I went in to get my malaria shots and so forth, and I asked the physician, so what's this little lump by my elbow? I wasn't sick. I'd run 6 miles that morning. I was in good shape as far as I knew. And he looked at that, became concerned, and that beautiful Friday afternoon in May, he did a biopsy in the office. The biopsy led to a diagnosis of lymphoma. And instead of going to Kenya, I went to Indianapolis and started chemotherapy. I have 2 girls. The younger one was still in diapers, and the other one I think was still in preschool. So it wasn't a heart attack, but it did give me pause to start thinking about life, I think, in new ways. You know, at one level, I guess I could have been called, excuse me, a professional theologian, although Quakers use words like that unsparingly, or sparingly, I would say. So I had a lot of knowledge, but knowledge is not the same thing as wisdom. What was my life deep down going to be? Well, obviously I escaped lymphoma. The doctors said I would probably respond well to chemotherapy, and I did, but they said it would probably come back, which it did 5 years later. So I went through the whole process again. And at that point, I had some concern that, well, this may become a repeating process, and I think the time framework in between may get shorter, and at some point, this is going to unravel. And it never has. I never have had a diagnosis since then. So that's where the grace that I wrote about in today's blog comes from. And for me, there's a real relationship between grace and love. And at least for me personally, it implicates God, and it may or may not for you. We'll get to that in a few minutes when we talk about spirituality. So I wanted to use this quotation from John West as his experience, and most of us have, I think, experiences in life. It's one of those moments, as he calls it, in which life gets focused, it gets simplified, and maybe takes us to one word: love. And there's a kind of clarity which is wonderful in that, a clarity for who am I and what am I about? And those are some of the key questions that I understand spirituality to be dealing with. So in some ways, I would say, yep, I'm about love. And if I could explain why I've lived this long, I would say, well, I've got a lot to learn about love, and I'm still a student in the process. And I want to invite you into the process. You can be a student, you can be a teacher. Quakers don't much care because roles don't count too much for us. Well, you can see the other quotation comes from a newer friend of mine, Ilia Delio, who's really an amazing woman. Lives in the DC area. She's both a scientist and a theologian. One of the few people in my associations anyway, who has a doctorate in both science and theology. And she has a particular way of looking at theology, which has been both challenging and reassuring for me. But she also has that scientific foundation, which I find delightful. And I'm going to lift a few quotations from her as we go along through these sessions. And the first one today is picking up on John West's notion of love. But Delio says, love is the fundamental energy of evolution. Not surprisingly, she does think that the world evolves. She thinks human beings evolved and perhaps are evolving, and perhaps even God. And she says there, in her estimation, there is that fundamental energy in life and in the universe, and she names it as love. There's a spiritual tradition, not only in Christianity, but some of the other major traditions where this would fit. Okay, there is an energy. If we don't have any energy, we don't get out of bed. So I do think in some ways spirituality has to do, perhaps in a kind of quip, spiritual has to do with how we're using the energy in our lives as we go through day after day. And if we can if love really is the fundamental energy, then let's tap into it and channel it and act out of it in really good creative ways. Because as we all know, love, another word in Latin, if you take it into Latin, is you get the language of passion. People can be passionate about bad things, destructive things, what I would call non-spiritual things or bad spirituality. So the real challenge for us as human beings, as individuals and as communities is, how do we tap into that fundamental energy of the universe, which is love, incarnate it in a way that then enables us to act towards the good and make the world an even better place as we co-create in the universe. There are some big problems as we all look ahead, and let's be creative rather than destructive. Again, as we roll along, I would welcome folks to throw in your comments, and it doesn't have to be a question. You can make a comment. I reiterate the fact that there's no doubt a lot of wisdom represented in the people on this call, and so I welcome that. All right. Now I want to move to the definition of spirituality. It's not unusual among the college students that I spend quite a lot of time. It's not unusual even in older groups of people to hear the phrase, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. And I never presume I know what that means when they say that. Sometimes I think they know what they mean, and other times I'm not sure they know what they mean. Appropriately, I think our sessions are focused on spirituality. Sandra Schneider's, and you can see I'm quoting from her in the top 2 bullet points. Sandra Schneider's is another friend of mine, so I pick on my friends. Schneider's is a now just retired professor at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley, affiliated with the University of California there at Berkeley. Absolutely delightful woman. Sandra Schneider's is the IHM stands for, if you're Catholic or know that stuff, she is a member of a religious order. She and I have had coffee any number of times in Berkeley, and if you walked in, you'd know I'm not a nun, but you wouldn't think she's a nun either. So quite frankly, some of my best and most delightful friends in this world are monks and nuns. So if you've got a stereotype about them, it probably isn't accurate unless you see them as very engaged people with a great sense of humor and a capacity for fun. Those are the monks and nuns I know. Sandra Schneider's has offered a little larger quotation than I lift. I just lifted parts of it. It's a fairly dense one, but I thought, well, I'm going to be with smart people. Let's use something like really good. And the first thing I will tell you is, if you look quickly at the whole slide, I'm defining spirituality and the word God is not there. You're right. So I personally don't think you have to throw God into a definition of spirituality. Personally, I'm happy with God. Well, not always, but I'm happy with the notion of God. I would say, yeah, I believe in God, and you should ask me more questions because you don't know too much about what I mean by that yet. So let me read through the first bullet point and unpack that a bit. And again, if we're not clear here, which probably means if I'm not clear, send a note through the chat and we'll see if we can get more clarity. Schneider says spirituality is the capacity of persons to transcend themselves through knowledge and love. That is, to reach beyond themselves in relationships to others, and thus become more than self-enclosed material monads. A monad is somebody who's living by herself or himself, kind of in your own little world, unaffected by others, a non-transcendent way, if you will. So the capacity of persons to transcend themselves through knowledge and love. When I think about transcending myself, to me, that means getting out of or beyond myself. Knowledge can do it. Love certainly does it. To reach beyond myself in relationships to others, to become more than self-enclosed. So I'm wondering, can I pause just a minute and see what kind of comments, or maybe if somebody can even come on and ask a question? I'd love to know what even that much means, even without going to the other two bullet points. As you think about that, self-transcending. I'd be intrigued with how people think you self-transcend. Sammy, do you know that word, self-transcend or transcend?
Can you clarify it a little bit?
Well, yeah, the trans means to go across in Latin, or to go beyond. So think about transportation, something like that, which takes you from here to there.
Yeah. So whenever I read this, it reminded me of something that we talked about in class, which was, it was a while ago. We were reading from Walsh's book, and he talked about dedicating stuff that you do to a higher power.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote something about it. Because for me, like, I think of spirituality as just something greater than myself.
Okay.
And I think that's kind of like how you said college students sometimes say they're spiritual but not religious. And some of my friends said that, and how they always described it was they believe in a higher power, they just don't know what it is. So, and that's kind of like confusing for me, because personally, like, going back to dedicating stuff to a higher power, I don't know how you could do that if you don't know what the power is. So,
right.
So yeah, he went through an exercise where you just pick something that you do in your day-to-day life and you dedicate it to something greater than yourself. And I personally found that very helpful, because like during COVID and everything I went through, I called it my faith crisis, where I was just confused on my religious beliefs and spirituality and all of that. But I find that exercise very helpful, because it makes me feel like I'm living for something greater than myself, which gives me intention with my life. I feel like.
Right. That's good. That's good. I like the idea. Intention with my life. It's not pointless.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you've got that. Yeah. Oh, we've got some coming in now. Let's see what they say. Oh, my friend Nancy. Hello. The simplicity that has emerged for me today is beauty. Beauty will include love. I love it. And Richard says, for me, transcendence begins with understanding that I am not at the center of the universe, but can grow by experiencing relationships with others and with nature. I like the addition of nature there. That was a good add-on to what Sandra Snyder said, Richard. Thank you for that. And thank you, Nancy. So we can impact that beauty. Wow, I don't know where all of you who are on this call are, but in Cleveland, it's a spectacular day. We're having a tinge of summer weather here in November. So beauty is all around us. Not all the leaves have fallen. So I loved your add-on, Nancy. Yeah, so self-transcending. I think if we wind up living life just for ourselves, perhaps driven solely by self-interest, one, I don't think that's very spiritual. And finally, it's not very satisfying. So let's do the second bullet point now from Sandra Snyder's. This is really within the same quotation. I just broke them apart. She said, spirituality is the experience of conscious involvement in the project of life integration through self-transcendence towards the ultimate value one perceives. Wow, that's a bunch of words that I know what they all mean, but you put them together and it's a convoluted, not even a sentence yet. But two or three things I would lift up. One, spirituality has first and foremost to do with experience. And any of you online with me today who are Quaker know that. Since I live for the most part among folks who aren't Quakers, as opposed to being at Earlham, which was a Quaker school, so they were all over the place. But most of my work I spend with people who aren't Quakers, so I can tell them whatever I want that Quakerism is, and they have to believe it. But my sense of being a Quaker is it always starts with experience and not doctrine. And so Quakers have been spiritual from the get-go, from 17th century England. Whether you want to date it with George Fox's trip up Pendle Hill in 1652, or for him personally, I think it was a little before then. But Quakerism starts with experience. And spirituality is, as I like Schneider's, an experience of conscious involvement. It's conscious. Sammy's word was intentional. I'm consciously involved, and I might add, participating in the project of life integration. And here, Schneider's helps me anticipate what I think we can do around that theme of wholeness that's in the title. I want a life that's integrated. Think of the opposite word, disintegration. My life is fragmented. My life is going to pieces. We all know people like that. And I've been in situations myself where I felt like things were coming apart instead of going together. So think about spirituality as my daily experience of being consciously involved in the project of life integration through self-transcendence toward the ultimate value one perceives. And maybe this is where Schneider is at least avoiding the word God. The ultimate value for me, I think, would be God. I'm okay with that word. I'm okay with Sammy's two words, higher power. I do think a lot of students would say, well, they believe in a higher power, but they quit thinking at that point. If you ask them, so what's that mean? They really haven't thought about it. And it's not easy to think about what a higher power is. And here, let me begin to help you connect the dots, at least the way I do, when I think about a higher power, which I'm okay as a metaphor for God, I would link it back to the earlier Delio quotation and say, oh, that's that fundamental energy that's at the heart of the universe. That's the higher power, Sammy, for me. That fundamental energy, which is God. I know classically they called God the Trinity in Christian terms, and you can call God Father, Son, and Holy Spirit if you want. You can do Mother, Son, and Holy Spirit if you want. I mean, there's all sorts of ways of talking about that. But the ultimate value, we all know that we're mortal, and spirituality has to take that into account, deal with it, and make sense out of it to integrate it. And so perhaps paradoxically, maybe ironically, Schneider's is talking about spirituality as a project of life integration, and it's through self-transcendence. It's like getting beyond or over myself as, what was it, Richard said, I'm the center of the universe. I mean, all of us know that's not true. So what does it mean to start living into the truth of that? That's what I think Schneider's is pointing to. I certainly have multiple values, as I suspect most of us do. I know I've done a fair amount of work on the Kendal values, and they have plural, it's values. In fact, I like to chide them and say, you've got so many, I can't remember them all. So I'm pushing them to simplify it a bit. But we all have values, but what's the ultimate value? The most important one, or however you want to talk about it. And that's, for me, spirituality. And I don't doubt for a minute that for many people, that's God. For many people, to say God implicates Jesus. For others, to say God is, if you're out of the Hindu tradition, it's one thing. If you're in the Buddhist tradition, it's like, oh, I thought Buddhists they didn't believe in God. Well, they don't, the way most people do it. So I don't want to get into that kind of stuff, because then we get into religion. So I first want to start talking about experience. For me, spirituality is about experience. And then the next thing that I drag in here is a quotation from Vicky. She's got a tougher name to say. This is from a different resource. But I like what Vicky does. It's a simpler one. So she says, spirituality is viewed as beliefs, practices, and experiences. There's experiences again. So it's beliefs, practices, experiences that shape and create a way of knowing and living that may or not be informed by any religious ritual, tradition, and doctrine. A person makes the conscious choice to practice spirituality by seeking answers about the self, the universe, and meaning in life. I apologize for my head there. This is actually pretty cool. It's the first time I figured out how to get myself into a slide. So it's anything but self-transcending. So first of all, spirituality is beliefs, practices, and experiences. And part of what I like to do, whether it's tomorrow morning again with Sammy in class, or maybe whoever's online goes out and has coffee with me, I would say, well, tell me about the beliefs you have in life. Tell me about your practices and experiences that shape the way you know and the way you live. And the person who says, you know, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, they may have no sense of any religious ritual, no affiliation with any kind of religious tradition, and they don't have any truck with doctrine. But you do have to think about spirituality. And I would say, I dare say, you can't have an experience without having thought about it and being able to tell me about it. The other thing that interests me about Vicky Z's definition is she says a spiritual person is making the conscious choice. The conscious choice to practice spirituality. Seeking answers about the self, the universe, and the meaning of life. There must be something, and I am pushing this agenda, so I'll be upfront about it. There is something about spirituality and being conscious, or I like Sammy's word, intentional, which is alternative to habit, routine, and living robotically, which frankly, I think is characteristic of a lot of the lives of younger people I associate with and some older people. Again, I just came out of a leadership class I do with student athletes every semester. It's really interesting. Today, we were talking about temperance, an old-fashioned word that means moderation or balance. And it's so clear today that people's lives are a temperance issue because of cell phones. Maybe not for those of you online, but the students admitted they spend too much time on their cell phones, and one thing led to another. And they all meaning all 20 of them in the room, pulled out their phones. And of course, the phones will tell you how much per day do you spend on. And the students were appalled. Some of them were 5 hours a day, which means you only have 19 hours left for everything else, sleep included. And maybe all of you online with me today think, oh my gosh, 5 hours a day, that's unbelievable. And probably for you, it is unbelievable. But that makes my point that people who are on their cell phones for 5 hours a day are not making a conscious choice anymore, because they've fallen into, at least deeply attached, if not addicted. And usually there's no real room in spirituality for those two things, being unduly attached and addicted. And they are not consciously choosing to practice spirituality by seeking answers about the self, the universe, or the meaning of life. Well, I don't spend 5 hours a day on my cell phone. I may squander my time other ways. And it seems to me spirituality is really designed to enable us not to squander life, but to suck the marrow, the deep marrow out of life. So Sammy, do you find that surprising that maybe some of your peers have spent 5 hours on a cell phone in a day?
Honestly, I'm not surprised, really. I mean, it's like a shot, like that's a lot of time to spend on your phone, but I'm not really surprised. And like going back to the like conscious choice, that is something that I don't think that I spend 5 hours a day on my phone, but I know that I'm on it too much, or I was. And then when I took the class with Alan, it kind of made me realize like how attached I was. And then it came down to me saying for so long, oh yeah, I know I'm on my phone too much, but I never did anything about it. And then finally I had to make the decision, like, okay, you actually need to like put your phone away. And now I put my phone in my drawer for at least 2 hours a day. I don't get on it. I don't look at it. And it makes me feel a lot better, like mentally. It makes me feel my brain is very cleared and open.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's really nice. And not even just with the phone thing. I feel like to decide to do something, you have to just make the choice. Like you just have to do it. And then you'll thank yourself for it in the long run, mm-hmm. I think.
What was the hardest part in the beginning?
I don't know. So for me, it was always like, oh, what if someone, you mean about my phone?
Yeah.
Like I've always thought, what if someone needs to contact me or something? But it was never really an issue. Like nothing's that important. Nothing was that important where it couldn't have waited.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I got used to it. And
Yeah.
now it's great.
And you're making conscious choices.
Yeah.
So then the question will be, how do you sustain that? Our class will be over in about a month. So do you think you will be able to keep practicing or that, or will you?
I think like once, because I really do enjoy it. So now it's more about, it just makes me feel good.
Mhm.
So I'm not doing it for anyone else other than like, because it makes me feel better.
Mhm.
So yeah, I will definitely continue to do it after the class is over.
Yeah. One of the things that I would invite from those of you, thank you, Nancy, is I would love to hear from the folks on the call. How, if some of us older folks don't do it via cell phone, how are the ways we might be involved in life unconsciously, doing things maybe comparable to, I'm going to say, wasting our time on TikTok or Instagram. I'm personally not on any of those, so I'm not on those and feeling badly about it. But we perhaps have our own version of not living the way we want consciously and making the kind of choices. So I'd be interested in those of you who can add something to the chat in that vein. David has an interesting question here. Seeking answers to me implies that a person expects to end up with verbal formulations. But what about the mystic tradition, which doesn't expect to have the answers come in words? True, David. Is it possible, is it sensible to think that we'll end up with satisfactory intellectual constructs? Good question. I think the mystical way is perhaps one way to be spiritual, and I'm not necessarily thinking solely about that. One of the books that that Sammy and I are using, we're actually going to have a quotation from him pretty soon, in like today. He will talk about a unitive experience, which David, I think, would be a comparable experience to a mystical experience, and a unitive experience would be an experience where in the moment, however long a moment lasts, in the moment, I feel at one in the universe. And in that moment, I'm not even aware of me being me. So what I am experiencing now is not a unitive moment. I'm aware of me being me talking. I'm aware of Sammy on my screen and others out there. So that is not a unitive experience, and nobody can live in the middle of a unitive experience forever. Maybe that's what it is post-mortem. I don't know. I've never been dead yet. So so David, that would be, and in that experience, there are no ideas, there are no imagination, so no words, none of that. As I emerge from a unitive experience, then I could appropriately start thinking about, man, what happened? Or Sammy could ask me, what was it like? And I would have to scramble to start coming up with words and constructs to try to explain the inexplicable. And Gerald May, who's the guy we use his book, he's quite clear. He thinks that all of us have had unitive experiences, often brief, and they come and go, but we are so unaware, we don't catch it, we don't experience it, we don't even appreciate it. Is that fair, Sammy, to what we've read in there?
Yeah, I would say so.
So the problem with doing what we're doing now, David, is we're using words. I'm using words, so I'm making you think. I'm making you think in words, and so I think there's a facet of spirituality in that vein as well, but it's not the same thing as what you were pointing to. So let's move on just a little more. We'll get some other ideas, and maybe folks along the way will throw in some stuff. So we talked a bit about spirituality. I want to talk a bit about well-being. And I really, in my own mind, am contrasting well-being to the normal discussion about health and wellness the way I know our college campus has a wellness program now. We actually hired a woman, a good friend of mine, who does the wellness programs. I'm for all of that. I want to be physically as healthy as I can be, but I'm really more interested in what I'm calling well-being. And I'm just offering a couple possibilities here. The first thing I did in the first quotation is from the American Psychological Association, that's APA. They define well-being from a psychological standpoint as a state of happiness and contentment with low levels of distress, overall good physical and mental health and outlook, or good quality of life. And I want to say, amen, I want that. And I do. A state of happiness and contentment, yeah. Very little distress, good with that. Overall good physical and mental health and outlook, yes. Recognizing that as we get older, the good physical health may become a challenge, and even for many of us, the mental health becomes a challenge. And good quality of life. So I don't dismiss that, I want it. But I'm going to suggest for spirituality, there's even more than just psychological. And these are, if you will, major themes that we'll maybe chase over the next 2 or 3 sessions. Self-transcendence, you won't be surprised to find that there, given what Snyder's and others have said. A sense of being connected is perhaps my word for the relationships. Meaning. Can you imagine anybody saying, yeah, my goal in life is to live a pointless life? I think the problem, and maybe the spiritual quest, is to avoid the things that are supposed to be meaningful and aren't. And probably many of you could join me in cataloging some of the things in life I've chased that I thought would be meaningful, and it wasn't. Certainly not long-term. I understand, although I laugh a bit at how important the GPA is to students, the grade average. And I understand why it's important, so I don't belittle it. But on the other hand, all of us know once we graduate, can you remember the last time anybody asked you what your GPA was? I don't even know what mine was. So the spiritual addition to well-being is focused on self-transcendence, on being connected, on living a life that's meaningful. And then the last one, all these amorphous words like true self, by which I am okay with using the language of soul, my core, Quaker kind of language, my center, or just me with the big M, which somehow is different than my ego. And so I would like to get involved with those a little bit. Kathy, I like your question. What can make practices difficult? Struggling with grief. Let me see if at some point I can answer that a bit or speak to it. I don't know, answer, it's probably a bad choice of words. I've done a fair amount of work in hospice, and before I'm in my current position, I did quite a bit of work in, and that sounds pretty highfalutin. I was involved a lot with bereavement groups and grief groups. So let me find a way to speak to that, and others, maybe Lynn and others who know a whole lot more about that than I do. Okay, I'm not going to say anything more about well-being at this point. I want to talk a bit about wholeness, the wholeness of life. And I put this in the title because I'm really interested in living life that feels whole. And I go back to the Thoreau quotation in the beginning where he talked about too many of us are living desperate lives and life that doesn't feel like it's integrated. Again, thinking of the Snyder's quotation, definition of spirituality. My goal is to be involved, a conscious involvement in the process of life integration. Wholeness and integration for me are similar. There's a oneness to it. And think about disintegrating, and think about fragmentation, and all of the things in our society, in our world, and maybe in our lives that threaten us with fragmentation and disintegration. And I don't think, retiring or stepping away from a really busy job, or Sammy's got school and I'm going to do, and others will do exams and all that stuff to her pretty soon. It's really going to stress her, if not fragment her life. And how do I bring things back into balance? Well, one of my favorite authors, I never met him, so he's not my friend. Thomas Merton, arguably the most famous American monk of the 20th century, an activist. Merton wrote copiously. He was a really attractive human being in interesting ways. Grew up literally moving around with his artistic father and mother. He was born in France. He lived in England. He lived in this country. Was an atheist, was a communist through the 30s. In some ways, he was a mess. And then at the end of the 30s, he discovered God, if you will. And of all things, he wound up joining a monastery in the middle of Kentucky and lived there for 27 years when he was accidentally electrocuted when he was speaking at a Buddhist Christian conference in Bangkok, Thailand in 1968. So he's been dead 60 years, but his writings and his thoughts continue to be, I would argue, not only viable, but really helpful. He has a wonderful, really fairly lengthy poem called Holy Wisdom, Hagia Sophia. And I lift this piece up from that because I love the way he writes, and he's after a hidden wholeness, which is no secret since I put it in yellow there. So join me and just appreciate the words and what he's trying to point us to. He says, there is in all visible things an invisible fecundity, a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This mysterious unity and integrity is wisdom, the mother of all, natura naturans, which simply means nature doing what nature does. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity, a silence that is a fount of action and joy. It rises up in wordless gentleness and flows out to me from the unseen roots of all created being, welcoming me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. This is at once my own being, my own nature, the gift of my Creator's thought and art within me, speaking as Hagia Sophia, Sophia's wisdom, speaking as my sister, wisdom. So I suppose we could call that theology if you want, but it's really a spiritual description, and it points towards an experience. That's what makes it spiritual for me. And I would argue, as I'm sure Merton would, that it takes a conscious kind of living and intentionality, as Sammy put it, to recognize in all visible things, there is this invisible fecundity, fruitfulness, if you will. a dimmed light, a meek namelessness, a hidden wholeness. This unity and integrity, which is mysterious, is wisdom, who's the mother of all. And I think we could do this session, these sessions on spirituality as we're doing it, and then we could do another group on wisdom. I love this affirmation. There is in all things an inexhaustible sweetness and purity. And I want to live life where I presume that's true, and I'd like to know that's true, and I'd like to experience its truth and to live out of its truth. I think that's what Quakers were after, and we're not the only ones. There are a whole bunch of people. I think that's what Buddhists are after and Jews are after. There's an inexhaustible sweetness and purity. A silence that is a fount of action and joy. And in Merton's saying, it comes to me there, David, it's the wordless gentleness. It flows from the unseen roots of all created being. It welcomes me tenderly, saluting me with indescribable humility. And then I think Merton becomes fairly bold here, and I appreciate this when he says, this is at once my own being, my own nature. It's not out there, it's here, it's now, it's me. It's gift. I have Sophia, I have wisdom. I love it when parents name their little girls Sophia, wisdom.
I feel like something that I kind of correlated with this was what Gerald May calls willingness, like living willingly, which he describes as saying yes to the mystery of life. And I just think that's important if you want to, because I feel like sometimes everyone feels like they need to have total control over their own life.
Okay.
And I feel like living willingly will help find the beauty.
So Sammy, what does it mean to you what was it you said about the mystery of life, giving into it?
Gerald May said saying yes to the mystery of life.
What does it mean for you, whatever you are, 20 years old, 19 years old? What does it mean for you to say yes to the mystery of life?
I feel like, so I am someone who loves to plan everything, and I love to know exactly what's going on at all times. So I feel like for me, it's kind of more just going with the flow and not feeling like I need to be in total control, kind of just trusting, like for me, God, like trusting that what will happen will meant to happen, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So having more trust.
Okay.
Yeah.
And trust is a really big word. And
Or
the
faith, maybe.
way you can avoid trusting somebody is just to control them. So
yeah,
you're absolutely right. And for me, trust is really close, if not synonymous with faith.
Yeah.
Do I have faith in you? Do I have faith in the universe? Do I have faith in me? Do I trust you, the universe, and me? And I think that's a deeply spiritual question. So very good. All right, the next piece I want to do after, I might just mention a hidden wholeness. Some of you may know Parker Palmer, a Quaker author who is a longtime friend of mine. He has a book called A Hidden Wholeness. So if you were a reader, you might find that one interesting. So I'm interested in spiritual longing, because I do think, and I'm pretty confident Gerald May thinks, that to be human, so this is my presupposition, to be human is to be spiritual. And to be human and spiritual means that I inevitably have some longings. unless I think I'm going to be dead by sundown, I will have longings. I am leaning into the future. And I like the way Gerald May, I told you we'd get to him. He's a psychiatrist, a late psychiatry. He died a few years ago, and spirituality author. He identifies 3 spiritual longings that he claims are at the core of being human. He thinks all of us have a desire for unconditional love. And by the way, folks, he doesn't think any of us are capable all the time in every place of loving unconditionally. Conditional love, as you know, means if this, then that. If you be nice to me, I'll love you, kind of thing. But we have a desire for unconditional love. Probably many of us thought our moms were going to pull it off, and then we realized, no, I don't think they are. Secondly, we have a need for belonging and union. And I would affirm that. We really do have a need. It's interesting, he uses the word need instead of desire, a need for belonging and union. And we have a deep hunger just to be. Which sounds un-American, because in America, we are defined by what we do. And again, maybe that's one of the fears I have about retirement is, what am I going to say I do? And then who would that make me be? So we have a deep hunger just to be. And then I wanted to share this, which comes at the end of May's book. These are the last few sentences. Sammy hasn't even gotten there yet. We're still 3 weeks away, Sammy. Gerald May says, all too often the spiritual search seems very lonely. Part of this is inevitable. There are some things that are eternally reserved in privacy between the individual soul and the Creator. But even in our aloneness, we are together, for we each have it. At the deepest levels in our hearts, we are all aching for each other and for the same eternally loving one who calls us. It would be well, I think, if we could acknowledge this more often to each other. And I always laugh when I read that last section of his book. A very learned man. He's a psychiatrist, which means he has the MD and the residency to be the psychiatry guy he was. But he says, yes, this spiritual search can be lonely, and it's inevitable. But there are some things that are also true. Even in our aloneness, we are together. If you go to the second bullet point above, we do have this need for belonging and union. If you want one word, we have a need for relationship. And that's what I love about even having Sammy on this call today. It's like, okay, in August, I didn't know her at all. Now I would call her a friend, and she helps meet that need for belonging. Who knows where it will go, but we're in that process, and in that process together.
I'm very happy to be here.
Good. Well, you bring the average age down, I'm sure. Do you have anything else to add about Gerald May? He's the hardest book we read, as they tell me. See, I put students on the spot all the time, so Sammy's used to it. Say a bit more about the willingness part that the willingness part that you identified a little earlier. Do you remember what he contrasts willingly with? Are you on mute? Sammy, you're on mute.
I'm sorry. Willful. He talked about.
Willful. Yeah. He said right, go ahead.
That was pretty much the opposite of willingness. It's trying to gain too much control over your own life, which he kind of described that as what you don't want to do.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. He contrasts willfulness and willingness. And willfulness is the Sammy who's trying to be in control, the assertive. And at least he's suggesting that a lot of spirituality has to do with learning to be willing, to tap into that flow, etc. So let's add one more piece. This says, love is at the heart of it all. I'm going to go back to a Delio quotation. She's as you remember, the theologian and scientist. She says, to love is to be on the way toward integral wholeness, to live with an openness of mind and heart, to encounter the other, not a stranger, but another part of oneself. When we enter the heart of love, that integral wholeness of love that is God, we enter into the field of relatedness and come to see that we are wholes within wholes. Good thing you see this in print, huh? It's got that W on it. We come to see that we are wholes within wholes. This is the consciousness we need today, an integral wholeness of love that is open to new life, a being at home in love that can evolve. I wouldn't call that Delio's dream. I would call that her vision. It's one I want to join her in. And it seems to me, again, I speak as a Quaker because that's what I've been all my life. It seems to me that that was a part of the vision that, gosh, in 1652, George Fox had on top of Pendle Hill. That there was and you know, if you're familiar with the Christian Bible, the end of the last book of the New Testament talks about a new heaven and a new earth, a kind of vision, being very conscious of the climate conference going on in Glasgow as we speak. Can we move towards an integral wholeness, or are we going to continue to fragment life? It's all too easy to point to the whole political issue. I'll call it an issue, not a mess. The kind of way we're doing politics, it's fragmentary, it's divisive. And I think Delio gives me the recipe to say, well, if we can choose to be spiritual, we choose love. We tap into that love, if that is the fundamental energy of the universe, and we use it constructively rather than perversely. To encounter the other as part of myself, not a stranger. I'd love, and probably none of us want to sit for another hour, but I'd love to be a part of a group that says, how do we enter the heart of love? And maybe I can jump into Kathy's question about grief. If you struggle with grief, in some ways, I suspect we're struggling with love in the present tense. When we think about grief, we think about loss. And it could be loss of a husband, it could be loss of a child, it could be loss of a job. So whenever we lose something that's dear to us, we experience the loss. It's not just an intellectual construct, as David was pointing to appropriately. When we experience loss, it's like the W of whole falls off the word and it's a whole, H-O-L-E. And I don't know that one, Kathy, I don't know that one ever gets over grief. I think you come to terms with the loss and the grieving process, and I would say it's a process. The grieving process, at least as I heard people talk about it, the grieving process asks us to start again and again. Back in the day when I ran bereavement groups, it was not, and I would usually run one for like 2 months, and then that group would quit and we'd start another group. But honestly, there would be some people that would be in 2 or 3 or 4 consecutive groups, because they really needed to stay with the process as they work through it. And there's no uniform way that people do it. So I would say, just continue to engage the process. It's a daily walk. Be conscious of where you want to go. There's no question but what doing it with others is a much healthier, creative way to go. And a lot of the grief work means telling my story again and again, whether it's a story of the death of my husband, whether it's a story of the loss of my job. It's working my way through the emotions and the feelings and the thoughts. Some of them will actually hold me back from being able to engage life as I know I can and as I know I want to. So I think being with others is really important, and being with others who are willing to hear our story again and not roll eyes and say, oh my God, I've heard that one already. I don't need to hear it again. Because the telling of the story is part of the healing process. That you experience it as a struggle, I'm not surprised. That just means it's more and more real. If it's not a struggle, it wasn't all that big a deal. So that would be at least where I would start. Delio's language, I'm going to hop back into this quotation. Entering into the field of relatedness and come to see that we are wholes within wholes. Again, boy, it runs counter to our American culture. It is a consciousness, Ilya. It is a consciousness that we need today, an integral wholeness of love that is open to new life, a being at home in love that can evolve. We're getting near the end, gang. I think I have one more slide. So if there are pieces you want to touch on, shoot a chat, and I'll go to what I believe is my last slide. I've talked about quite a lot today, and so this is a bit of a poke at humor. Anytime you run into Zen masters, it's usually going to be slightly humorous. And I just entitled it, So We Won't Miss It. The disciple asked the master, is there anything I can do to make myself enlightened? Master, as little as you can do to make the sun rise in the morning. Perplexed, the disciple says, then of what use are the spiritual exercises you prescribe? Master, to make sure you're not asleep when the sun begins to rise. In our involvement, even in a session like this today, I'm grateful because it keeps me thinking about it. It keeps me awake. It's a practice. It's a spiritual exercise for me. Pulling some of this stuff together, sharing with you, wishing we had more time and I could go out and shut up and listen to you for a while. That's what it is. And so over the next 3 sessions or so, what I'd like to do is explore in a little more detail, what does it mean to be spiritual? How do I come to experience well-being? And how do I discover, create wholeness so that I feel life is whole? So are there comments? I'd like to quit. We've got 9 more minutes, or we can leave early. Are there comments, either verbal or through the chat, that we could offer? Sammy, why did you want to do this? I certainly don't require it, or there'd be 25 or 6 others on this. Why did you do this, Sammy?
I thought that it was something that I could learn a lot from. It sounded like something that was interesting. So I was like, why not?
Yeah. So what's your takeaway today? I ask students this sometimes. What do you take away from having been here now?
What was that?
What do you take away from this? You did it today. So what?
I did.
Did you get anything out of it? What stands out for you? What did you grab onto?
Oh boy. I might need a minute to think about it.
Well, you know, I'm patient. Others.
Yes.
You could even put in the chat, what did you latch on? What did you hear that you liked, or what would you love to hear more about? All right. It really makes me think. Well, good. I achieved something. I like that, Terry. Thank you. Kathy, I appreciate the focus on love, intention, and practice. Very good. Kim, I like the concept of wholeness. Yeah, so I remember very well, Gerald May's definition of soul, Kim. He says soul is the essence of who you are. And that's what I was trying to get at when I called it soul, center. It's the me with a capital M. It's the essence of who you are. And in that sense, I think everybody's got a soul, or is a soul. I prefer to say you are a soul rather than you have one. I'm not sure what, Sammy, we haven't had that discussion yet. So I really like talking about you are a soul rather than you have one. Well, I appreciate the contributions in the chat box. There may be more. And if not, maybe we can bring this to an end. Sue, you're there at least. We can finish 5 minutes early.
Be on also, I'm not sure, but I want to thank everyone for attending. And for our members, this is part of a 4-part series, and we will have our next session on next Tuesday. That is November the 16th at 2 o'clock. Once again, we will have Sammy and Alan join us, and we look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much for your time and your attention and your great comments.
Yeah,
Have
I
a
love it.
great
So
day.
hopefully some will come back, and if you have anything, send me an email. I'd love to hear from folks. Have a wonderful week. Sammy, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.